I'm just going to sit here for a while. And I'm not really going to engage with you. I'll just let you sit back and read. I mean, isn't that how we all learn anyway? I start off almost every single one of my presentations with this slide. You know, when I go to places and speak and share, people don't go to sit back and read a slide presentation. They show up in my sessions, they show up in my keynotes, they show up in my workshops because they want to hear me share. They're hopeful that I'll be able to share something with them that transforms what they do on a day-to-day basis and can then impact the kids in their classrooms in a very real way. And we know that engagement is a lot more than sitting back and simply reading the slides on a text. And the same thing is true in classrooms. Engagement with kids requires a lot more than just sitting back and being passive consumers of information. It requires give and take. It requires conversation. It involves getting real. The purpose of this presentation, the purpose of this session, is to help us be reminded that real learning, lasting learning, is just like learning to ride a bike. You know, if my kids could learn how to ride a bike when they were 4 years old and never forget how, surely in our classrooms we can teach students content Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and have them remember it the following week, even after our traditional test on Friday. If we're simply teaching to the test, kids will never remember. Teach in your class like we teach to ride a bike, and kids will learn for a lifetime. Well, sorry, didn't mean to have this on here. Just a random endorsement from Austin Powers for my book. I apologize. Let's get back to what real learning is all about. So what triggered this presentation? What triggered this this thought process on my end? Well, it's something that's been bubbling up for a while, but this article from the Washington Post is a good summation of what I've been thinking. You know, we've had initiative after initiative, protocol and policy after protocol and policy, legislation after legislation, from No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds to Race to the Top. We've had Common Core, we've had new state standards, we've had next generation science standards, we've had focuses on literacy and reading, we've had focuses on math and STEM. Yet, nothing seems to be working. We keep seeing the same results. And as a matter of fact, what we're seeing now might actually be worse than what it was before. As we continue to chase the silver bullet, as we continue to chase the secret sauce and the magic pill, we keep missing the mark. Sorry, another shameless plug, this one from Jen Aniston. It's pretty cool though. You know, it's interesting. I'm in education, a career educator. I've been doing this job now for more than 20 years. And I've seen this statistic. I've seen this chart many, many times. And every time I see it, it blows my mind. Let me just quickly show you what this chart demonstrates and what it represents. This chart represents human brain development. When do we learn the most? On this chart, there's a vertical line, indigo line, a purple line, a red line, depending on what it looks like to your eyes, that represents 5 years old. Everything to the left of that line is prior to 5 years old. Everything to the right of that line is after 5 years old. What we can see very clearly from this chart is that the human brain does most of its development before the age of 5. What's interesting is here in America, there's an event that takes place in the lives of almost every single student, every single child across the country at the age of 5. It's pretty simple. They start going to school. It's also fascinating when we correlate that with this chart. More learning takes place in a human being's life before they start school than the other 95 years combined. We are the professionals. We are the career educators. Our job is to be brain developers. Yet science shows us that more brain development takes place before kids get to us, the experts, than after. Something to think about. Oh, even Superman's endorsing it. It's so embarrassing. So let me talk about who I am first, because I think knowing who I am will put the rest of this in context. First and foremost, I'm a dad. 4 amazing kids. Most of what I talk about in this presentation and every presentation is really rooted in what I do with my own kids. You know, the idea of teaching my kids to ride a bike is something that I've had to do now 4 times. My oldest child is in 8th grade, 13 years old. My youngest is 4 years old. I've got a 1st grader and I've got a 3rd grader in the middle there as well. My kids are absolutely amazing. I spent the bulk of my career in the state of Michigan. 17 out of my 20 years have been in Michigan. I spent 3 years in Florida. I've been a classroom teacher. I've been an assistant principal. I've been a principal at both the elementary and the middle school level. I now work in central office. On the side, I also run. I run a lot. And I call it therapy for my mind, therapy for my body. Some of that will come into play later on in this presentation as well. It's important that you know all this foundational information because oftentimes when I speak in metaphors and parables with the understanding that some of the greatest teachers in the history of the world spoke in metaphors and parables, and their teachings caught on. So I try to do the same thing. But knowing who I am and what makes me tick will come into play later on. So hang on tight. So first of all, let's think about it differently. We understand that lasting learning comes from doing. I mean, that there's really no other way to learn. We could have kids just sit in their seats and listen to every word we say and tell them to write it all down, to take notes and regurgitate that information back. But is that really learning? Or is it just cheating in a more sophisticated way? You know, we yell at our kids and we call them cheaters if they copy off of their classmates who are sitting next to them. But we celebrate them and we give them an A when they do the same thing to us. If they just sit back and literally regurgitate back exactly what we told them and spit it back, maybe even in their own words, we give them an A. We need to teach kids how to think and how to do, because that's what learning is all about. And I use these examples all the time. As a father of 4, I remember when I first found out that my first child was on the way. I did a lot of freaking out, a lot of panicking. I was extremely nervous. I went to the library and picked up virtually every single book I could find on the idea of parenting. And I read them cover to cover, Baby-Wise and Parenting for Dummies and all the Dr. Spock books. And I thought I was ready. But you know the only thing that prepares you for being a parent? Being a parent. That's right. In high school, I played lots of sports. I played basketball and volleyball. And I even dabbled in football a little bit. I'm scrawny. I've been skinny my whole life. And I was never really good at sports. But it's interesting because I used to go to all the practices, went to all the film sessions, memorized all the playbooks, memorized the script on how to play. But you know what's interesting about sports? That's right. The only way to get better at sports is to actually play the sport. It's actually true with absolutely everything we want to learn in the world. If we want to prepare our kids to learn skills and learn content to prepare them for the real world, let's set them up to do, not just sit back and be passive recipients. I'm going to ask you to do a short little experiment. You can do this by yourself. You can do this with somebody else if you're watching this with somebody else. You can do this with a spouse or a friend. I want you to think about one of 3 moments from your past. I want you to either think about the moment you learned how to swim, the moment you fell in love, or the moment you became a reader. And I want you to think about it. Go ahead and close your eyes and think about it. Try to process it. If I were to give you 1 minute to describe that moment, to describe the moment you became a swimmer, describe the moment you fell in love, or describe the moment you became a reader, could you do it? Pick any of those 3. You know, I've done this at every session I've ever presented on this. And you know what's interesting? After a minute, when I cut people off from sharing, inevitably, half of the crowd is still talking. It's interesting. I tell them to describe the moment, but for most people, it's a full story. They describe how they were thrown into the deep end and they panicked and they started a doggy paddle and eventually swam to the side of the pool, but then they realized they were a swimmer. Talking about falling in love. The people that have been married for a long time give the right answer and say that they're still falling in love. There are others that talk about the moment they locked eyes with somebody across the bar and they walked up and they started to talk and they went on a date and they fell in love. Or maybe it was the readers and talked about how they would get read picture books before bedtime every single night. And then eventually they started to memorize a few words and then the patterns and sentences. Inevitably, though, every single person starts describing a process. They all describe the process of learning to swim. I've never been in a presentation where I've actually shared with Michael Phelps. So all of us are still on our journey towards getting to be the greatest swimmer, falling in love, yet to present to Romeo or Juliet. We're all hoping and longing for that kind of love. Being a reader, an amazing, gifted, proficient master reader, I don't even know what that looks like. Does that mean that you're like the old Micro Machine man from the 1980s who can read text super, super quickly? Does it mean that you can infer meaning from Shakespeare and classic literature? What does it mean to be a reader? Well, again, it's all part of the process. Learning is always part of the process. I've had conversations with kids from across the country. I've had conversations with my own kids to ask them what it is that they like best about school. I've got conversations about this on my podcast. And inevitably, kids describe hands-on learning activities, doing labs in science, having debates in social studies. They talk about recess, where they learn about becoming better friends. They always talk about doing. They always talk about being active participants in the process. And you know what is relevant, what's cool, what's important, is that Benjamin Bloom, 50, 60 years ago, said that that's where lasting learning came from. We've all heard about Bloom's taxonomy. You know, it's been said before that Bloom's taxonomy is the most talked about theory in education that the fewest people have actually taken the time to read. But in essence, Bloom's taxonomy, or Webb's depth of knowledge, discusses learning and cognitive complexity and takes different elements of learning and places them on a scaffold, with higher order thinking like creativity or creation and evaluation being things that require more cognitive energy and ultimately get lodged into long-term retention. Lower level tasks, remembering, understanding, so content regurgitation, simply memorizing and recalling facts, tend to be lodged into short-term memory. You ever think about when you go to a dinner party and you ask somebody's name, and then an hour later you're like, oh, what was that person's name? Well, you could have recalled it 5 minutes after you learned it, but the more information gets placed into your short-term memory, the more people you meet, the more displaced that short-term memory becomes. In order to recall more things in your short-term memory, more things have to leave your short-term memory. Oftentimes in our schools, we ask kids to remember and memorize a whole lot, and then we get frustrated when they can't remember things beyond a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in time. If we want our kids to truly learn things that last a lifetime, we have to start focusing on evaluation, analysis, and creation. We'll talk way more about that later on. But principals, the same challenge is for you. Think about your staff meetings. In your staff meetings, are you asking teachers to create and evaluate and analyze? Again, we'll talk way more about that as we go. This is actually a presentation, a session that typically takes 3 to 4 hours to go through and to get people to truly work with. I don't want anybody to think, hey, he's telling us we're not supposed to just sit and get, and he's just sitting and getting. No, this is just a quick preview, so just know that. Yeah, I've shared this video multiple times in a lot of places. I'll share it really quickly. It's how I taught my daughter to ride a bike. This video was filmed about 2 years ago when she was 5 years old, I believe. So maybe it was 3 years ago. This is me teaching her how to ride a bike. Enjoy.
These are the pedals. You just get on, you pedal so fast, and you turn the handlebars just like that. That's all there is to it? Okay. Now, think you're ready. You're going to be an expert bike rider. I just taught you how.
It's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? That's not how we teach kids how to ride a bike. We don't have them just sit down at a desk in front of us and watch us demonstrate and talk about the various parts. In order to teach a kid to ride a bike, we actually have to get them on the bike to ride. So why is it in our classrooms where we're preparing kids for life and to apply skills and content that will hopefully transcend the classroom, do we make it look just like this? Lasting learning is so much more than what we've made of it. Lasting learning requires a lot more than modeling. I can't just ride my bike up and down the street in front of my daughter and expect her to learn how to ride. Sure, that might pique her interest and make her excited, but if I really want her to learn something, to learn a skill that will last for the rest of her life, I need to make sure that I'm getting her on the bike. There's actually a 7-step process to teaching kids to ride a bike, a 7-step process to engage students in lasting learning. It goes from making it safe, setting small goals, helping them with balance and momentum, all the way down to making practice fun, and then eventually letting them go. You want to learn more? You want to learn the 7 steps and what they look like in your room? Join me. It's like riding a bike.